Well, good evening and welcome to our live stream on this Saturday, the last Saturday of June 28th. Hope you're having a great summer. We welcome you back from a couple of weeks of being off, just some rest and relaxation. And we're thrilled to be back. And they used to say on the radio, better than ever. We'll see. Not complications, but hopefully the live stream goes well as we kind of get back into to a groove. So let's just jump in. This weekend and the following weekend are special emphasis weekends for us. Our Heritage Sunday weekend. This, of course, weekend. Next weekend is the annual Wake Up America message, and then following all of that, we get back to a regular routine of a summer series, which we'll be sharing with you beginning on July 13th, I believe, or 12th, somewhere in there. So grab up your favorite Bible version, Bible app. You can open that. We'll be in Exodus chapter 2 to begin with, and then kind of flowing in later to another passage found in Everybody Has a Story. Some say you'll know when you're accepted as a part of a family when they have a story about you that they often share. And I know in my wife and I's relationship, that statement held true. The story is told of two men riding a tandem bicycle up a steep hill. And after much effort, they finally made it to the top of the hill. The front rider said, "Man, that was a tough ride." To which the second rider replied, "Sure was. If I hadn't kept the brake on, we might have slipped back." I'm sure they tell that story every time that they get together. Some stories are silly, some are serious. All have a significance. In what way are stories significant? Well, stories play a vital role in revealing character, a course of a person's life, and even the commitment of a person or organization. The story is told of a prosecuting attorney in a small town courthouse who called his first witness, an elderly lady, to the stand. He approached her and asked, "Mrs. Jones, do you know me?" She responded, "Why, yes, I do know you, Mr. Williams. I've known you since you were a young boy, and frankly, you're a big disappointment to me. You lie, you cheat, you manipulate people and talk about them behind their backs. You think you're a rising big shot, but you haven't the brains to realize you will never amount to anything more than a two-bit paper push. I know you, Mr. Williams." Well, the lawyer, Mr. Williams, was stunned. Not knowing what to do, he pointed across the room and asked Mrs. Jones, "Do you know the defense attorney?" And she replied, "Why, of course I do. I've known Mr. Bradley since he was a youngster too. I used to baby. Has been a real disappointment to me. He's lazy, bigoted, and has a drinking problem. The man can't build a normal relationship with anyone, and his law practice is one of the shoddiest in the entire time, Mr. Bradley." The judge wrapped the courtroom to silence and called both lawyers to the bench. And in a very quiet voice, he said with menace, "If either of you ask if she knows me, I'll hold you in contempt of court." What does that have to do with the price of eggs in Yugoslavia? Well, stories are revealing that can leave you reeling, but they also are unveiling as to where you've been and ultimately where or who you've become. Albert Einstein is quoted as saying, "If you want to know the future, look at the past." Alex Haley, the author of Roots, wrote, "Unless we learn from history, we are destined to repeat it. This is no longer merely an academic exercise, but may contain our world's fate and our destiny." American philosopher George Sand's work, The Life of Reason, Reason in Common Sense, puts it this way: those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Now, your past doesn't necessarily dictate your future unless you don't consider it. When you learn from your past, you are more apt to discern your future. That's our focus tonight. And that's what we find in Scripture as we turn this evening to Exodus chapter 2, looking at verses 23, 24, and 25. In verse 23, it says, "Now it happened in the process of time." In other words, as it came to pass. And it's always used, this Hebrew phrase or Hebrew word is always used in the emphatic sense. And so there is a process. When it happened in this process, across this period of time, there wasn't a rebellion, there wasn't a revolt. The king of Egypt simply had lived his life in that position. He eventually lived out his life and passed away. Now it happened in this process. Of course, these many years, many days, this natural death has occurred. Well, what happens after his death? Well, it says, "Then the children of Israel groaned." Now, the Hebrew word here would be best translated sighed. You've probably been around someone who went almost like a disgust, maybe a frustration. In this sense here, they sigh. They sigh because of the bondage. The sigh is indicative either of their anguish, sense of danger, or maybe in this case, both. The king of Egypt had died. This link that they had, or this connection they had with him, is now gone. Someone new is stepping into a place of authority. It's just like in our country, while a democratic style of government, when one president leaves, another one comes, and things begin to change. And so they were concerned, maybe bewildered, but certainly the sigh of anguish or danger because of the bondage that was occurring. And not only did they have this internal sigh, this anguish and sense of danger, but they cried out. They cried out. It's a howling. It's a woe with me. And that cry came up. It ascended to God. This cry ascended to God because of their bondage. You kind of get the picture. For a lot of years, things had gone somewhat well, and now the appreciation for the Hebrew people was changing, and now they found themselves in bondage. In verse 24, it says, "So God heard." Now, understand that God doesn't have to hear; He's not obligated to hear, but by nature, by the reality of who He is, He hears the cries of His people. Or in this case, it says that He heard their sigh. He heard their groaning, and it gives this idea that not only did He hear it, but He gave attention to it. There's times when people come to you and it's kind of the same old. They're complaining or crabbing about something, and maybe your hearing just kind of shuts off. You're not really paying attention to what they say because you've heard it all before. That's not the case with God. And so God heard their groaning. He gave attention to what they were sensing and what they were feeling. And as He was giving attention to them, He remembered, He recognized His covenant. It's the covenant that God had established. It's a covenant God had created between Abraham and then Isaac and then Jacob. And so he listened, he heard them, but he gives attention to them, and he considers or remembers the covenant that he has. In verse 25, it then says, and God, Elohim, the God of power, looked upon the children. He saw them. It became a knowledge that's the result of seeing them. He had given them attention, but he really sees them, inside of them, and he begins to understand, and ultimately he acknowledges them because of his compassion, because of the God that he is. And we begin to realize here that he hasn't forgotten his covenant with them. And he sees the dilemma that they are now facing. What follows these three verses at the end of Exodus chapter 2, what follows is the narrative of the story of God's work at freeing his people from bondage and leading them to the promised land. That is a story shared from one generation to another. It's the account of God's awareness of the Hebrews' dilemma and his decisive response of deliverance to free them from slavery. Now, my guess is your family has a story that is frequently told whenever the opportunity arises. Or perhaps it's a story that is shared during one of those teachable moments aimed at behavioral or character compliance. I refer to as remembrance triggers. They are a catalyst for walking down memory lane. God has a trigger as well. And it's found in this phrase, out of Egypt. And it's been shared amongst the Hebrew nation throughout the generations. The Lord God, the Lord brought us out from Egypt. 180 times that verbiage is found in the Old Testament. It is also found in the New Testament. When Stephen was about to be stoned to death, he begins and incorporates in his testimony this reality of what God had done for the Hebrew people in bringing them out of bondage and bringing them into the promised land. The writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 8 emphasizes the new covenant God was creating, which was inclusionary of this nation, but he highlights the covenant that God had established with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and throughout the Hebrew history, which now he was beginning a new covenant to all mankind. Now, there are four elements that this out of Egypt story aspires for God's people to recall. Four facets of their faith journey that God wants them and even us today to remember. What are those? Well, first of all, if you have your sermon guide, you can follow along. But in this out of Egypt story, we find the catalyst to recall God's creative ability. There is only one creator. It is only God who took nothing and made something. In Genesis 1:1, in the beginning. In the beginning, what? God created. It wasn't us. We had no idea. We had no ability. We had no authority, but God did. Because God created the heavens and the earth, he has authority over the heavens and the earth. He's in charge. He doesn't need permission. He doesn't need to consult with human beings. He isn't seeking our advice or guidance on anything. God has sole authority over all things. By him, all things were created. So, this out of Egypt is the catalyst for us remembering the past, remembering God's creative ability. Second of all, in how that plan unfolded. In the Bible, God's redemptive plan is often referred to as the scarlet thread. We find that to be the case in Genesis chapter, in Joshua chapter 2, verse 18. When you pick up some translations, you find that the words of Christ in the New Testament are written in red. It again just highlights this scarlet thread, this redemptive thread that is throughout all of the scripture. Paul stated it correctly when he said in Romans 5, you see, at just the right time when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. God's redemptive plan unfolded perfectly according to God's blueprint. No human being had a bearing on the coming of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ, or the covenant of Christ. And as the wisdom literature points out to us, we humans keep brainstorming options and plans, but it's God's purpose that prevails. This out of Egypt story also serves as a catalyst to recall God's initiative of grace and love. You see, the covenant of Christ was initiated by God because of his holiness. He's a God of love. He's a God of grace. God's character, rather than mankind's collusion, is the sole cause of the establishment of this covenant, plus the accessibility of this covenant to all mankind. And so Paul says God demonstrated his love, but also points out in Ephesians chapter 2 that it is by grace that we, and our faith, that we come into this covenant relationship. The fourth part, the fourth facet of this out of Egypt story that serves as a catalyst to recall God's responsiveness to his people. My mom told me the story when I was really young about the boy who cried wolf. And she, like her dad, was an incredible storyteller. And she told it in such a way, for a long time, I believed it actually was something that happened to a kid in our community. You probably have heard it, the child that cried wolf. There are people around you whose complaints and criticism turn from conversation and concern to noise and annoyance. However, because of God's compassion, he remains attentive and responsive to the cries and needs of his people. The psalmist wrote, the righteous cry out and the Lord hears. Here I am when it happens. If I cry out to the Lord, he is attentive to my heart, just as he was with the were in bondage. Now, you pull the fire alarm every time you face some difficulty or inconvenience, but I will tell you, God listens for you, and then he listens to you. God, see, he will hear you and listen to you, and as you cast your concerns upon him. Why all that difficult? However, contemplating our potential is demanding, in part because we are conditioned by our past. Satan has done a incredible work on God's people by keeping them focused on the negatives and failures of the past. If you've been in a church for any length of time, you know there are several kinds of stories that can arise. We remember back the way things were in our heyday, or maybe we remember back to the times that weren't so good, that times that were overly challenging. But the reality is that we can view those, and we can also look forward. It's important that we understand our past, that we learn from our past, but it, again, doesn't necessarily dictate, unless we don't learn from our past, what our future will be like. We've never done it that way before. You know those as the 7 words of a dying church. It's kind of a sad scenario in our culture that so many people look to the past and they're just anchored to it. Well, we've never done today what we did yesterday. And if yesterday was good enough, why would we want to do something different? Well, let me ask you this. You ever rode a bike? Used indoor plumbing, air conditioning, drove a car, owned a cell phone or computer? How about this? Ever use a credit card, purchase anything, pop something into a microwave? It isn't as if you're adverse to modern technology or convenience. So why is it that people are adamantly resistant to something different in the church? By the way, it's not really new. It's just unfamiliar. And that's the problem. Like to change. Boy, that's a bad word in the church. But because we're unfamiliar, uncertain as to what will happen. Think about all the things that have transpired in your life, in your spiritual life, in your church, in the life of the church that you had absolutely nothing to do with, but it brings you to this point. You learn from those things in order to move forward and forward in your days ahead. The byproduct of remembering or considering our past should be contemplating our potential. Learning from the past should make future undertakings easier and more eager to happen. I had a friend many years ago who used to sign his correspondence, all of his correspondence, with the phrase, "Great days ahead." No matter how good it is now, greater days are ahead. No matter how bad it is now, greater days are ahead. I've enjoyed some incredible God moments in my life, but there's always more to experience. The prospect of the righteous is joy. In Proverbs chapter 10, verse 28, it says, the prospect of the righteous is joy, J-O-Y. And I began to think about that. And so as we look to our past, whether it's in your past days as a follower of Christ, maybe you can do it in the life of your church, the prospects that come out of that reflection bring us joy. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, it's an acronym, because out of that reflection, out of considering the past, you can sharpen your journey of faith and relativity. Because no matter what has happened in the days gone by, it can be improved upon. Which brings us then to the O, which is the opportunity to be impactful. Society is changing, but the needs still the same. Mankind and what he needs in order to experience joy and peace and love are the same. It's been the same through generations because God has created each and every one of us. And so there remains this incredible opportunity to be impactful in your sphere of influence. And thirdly, what comes out of this reflection of this consideration of the past, and as you're contemplating your tomorrows, is a yearning to persevere, to keep going, and to ultimately serve as an instrument of righteousness for the Lord. There is value in looking at where you've come from, what you've experienced, considering our past. But the value is in looking and then realigning so that you can move forward in the future. Don't anchor yourself to the past. Yes, things change. You've changed. If you've aged, all of us have changed. Society has changed. There's change. That's the one consistent thing of our world. It's constantly changing. But the message of hope, the message of salvation only through Jesus Christ has never changed. So again, consider your past, but then contemplate your potential. It's endless. God's still working in our midst, but more importantly, he's still working through you and I. That's our heritage. That's our privilege. Thanks for being with us tonight. Look forward to next weekend, our annual Wake Up America message. It'll be worth tuning in, but we'll look forward to being with you at that point. God bless you.